Welcome back, growers. We're going to continue our work with the production calculator in this video. In part 1 of this series, I showed you how to determine your production targets for each crop you want to grow. Now in part 2, I will show you how we figure out how much growing space would be needed to achieve our production targets. Let's open up our production calculator again for this next phase. All right, we're back, and now that we've got all of our production targets totaled up here, we get to see where this spreadsheet really shines. It's going to take our giant grocery list that we've just made here and tell us how much space we need to devote to each crop. And it does that by using this average yield column here based on years of our growing data. We've tracked every single crop that we've planted and harvested in the last decade, and that data now informs our planning for the following seasons. If we make improvements to our spacing or growing techniques, our yield averages here can shift somewhat, but with the growing methods that we're using, we found these are really consistent year after year, so I can confidently use these numbers to plan our production and get the amount of food that we actually imagined having at the end of the season. So the next calculation that this spreadsheet is going to do happens here. It's going to tell us the number of beds required for each crop. And to calculate the number of beds required, the spreadsheet needs to know the size of our standard beds. To start off, we could just enter a size of 1 square foot, and that would basically tell us that to grow 15 kilograms of beans, we would need 37.5 square feet. But I don't want to go out to my garden and measure a patch that's exactly 37.5 square feet and do that for all of these numbers down below as well. I want a standardized system that uses our garden space efficiently and is easy to manage. So we use 2 standard bed sizes. The larger size is 50 square feet. And the smaller size is 12.5 square feet. So let's start by plugging in our large standard bed. Press enter there and you'll see all these numbers immediately recalculate. What they've done is just taken that same information, accounted for that larger bed size, and now we know that we need to plant 0.8 beds of beans, 1.6 beds of dried beans, 0.9 beds of beets, 0.2 beds of broccolini, etc. And during this phase, if your garden really isn't that established yet, you've got an opportunity to customize your bed sizes to make these numbers fall into more appropriate ranges. For example, maybe you had big dreams and you imagined that you'd organize your garden into standard beds that were 100 square feet in size. So we can give that standard bed size a try and see what we end up with. And if you look down this list here, now we are left with a bunch of little fractions of beds. We want to eventually round all of these numbers to whole numbers, and to get there, it makes more sense to have a bed size that's closer to the scale of our production. Alternatively, if we plan to do lots of smaller beds, maybe let's say 2 feet by 2 feet in size, so 4 square feet for each bed, we can give that a try too. And now we see that after the recalculation has completed, we're left with lots of huge numbers. And I don't want to go out and plant 20 small beds of beans for drying, or 12 beds of beets, or 7 beds of cabbage. Then my planning starts to be more complicated than it needs to be as well. So there's a sweet spot in the middle, and we found that for our homestead garden production, there's a group of crops that we like to grow generally for long-term storage that works pretty well with a bed size of 50 square feet. Then there's a niche of crops that are more in our kitchen garden area that work really well with a bed size that is a quarter of our standard bed, which works out to 12.5 square feet. We're using our 50 square foot beds for the most part, so let's switch that back. We can now see the exact number of beds that we would need for each crop and the total number of beds required as 43.8. So we've very easily determined here that our giant shopping list of vegetables can be produced with a capacity of 44 beds that are 50 square feet in size. But that's where we're going to cut it off in part 2 so you can get this work done yourself. So there's your homework for part 2. You can do this wherever you are, starting with your list of crops and their production targets. Divide those numbers by the yield per square foot you expect to achieve and your standard bed size if you have one. And that will leave you with the exact number of beds you should plant for each crop. While that is an important step though, it doesn't quite solve all of our problems. Because at this point, our calculations are just going to tell us stuff like we need to grow 3.256 beds of carrots or 1.27 beds of tomatoes. And those numbers are really messy to work with. I don't want to use anything like that in my garden plan. So in part 3, I'll show you how we simplify this information and make it work within our standardized growing system. This makes our garden planning process infinitely easier. So when you're all caught up, click right here to see what we do in this final step. Beep, boop, boop, beep, boop, 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 beep, boop, boop.